Hello everyone, my name is Kwesi. I am a historian. I love traveling to museums, historic sites around the world, and a lot of times in between work, I just like to share stories about them. So I'm currently in Louisiana. I'm at the Whitney Plantation, which interestingly enough talks about the story of the enslaved people. We're gonna hit some different spots. I kind of like this spot. It kind of has the banana tree vibe. I think it's a great place to start. And what we're looking at are actually on-site jail cells. And what's interesting is that this plantation is very large, so it was very common for large plantations to actually have holding facilities that they would put errant or quote-unquote misbehaving slaves or enslaved people in here. What's fascinating about these jail cells is that these are actually post-Civil War jail cells, meaning they were built 1870s, 1880s. I think this one is 1880 to 1890. And this is actually used to hold vagrant black men, meaning just someone who's walking the street who recently freed, is not employed under a former agency, and for petty crimes. So when we think about the structures that we have to deal with as a country, a lot of these things go back maybe generations, or perhaps in this case, about 100 plus years. Hopefully you guys can hear me. That's the overseer's house. And it was built in 1820 to 1860. And the actual last overseer that lived there had about 7 people enslaved, and he lived there for about 15 years. When we talk about these spaces, it wasn't always the quote-unquote master coming down and being really abusive, damaging, traumatic. It was often done by the overseer, the person who kind of worked directly, day-to-day, hands-on with the enslaved people. So just kind of a structure to think about. We're at the slave quarters of the Whitney Plantation. What's interesting is that very few current plantations actually have slave quarters. Just a quick note, this is not what the standard slave quarter looked at all. Most of them were shacks, very poorly built, very fragile. This one's actually sturdy. It's actually been invested in. This is what would be called a remodel. I think some parts of it are the original. And I want us to just kind of take a minute and think about this. Enslaved people will often work sun up to sundown. In this place, they worked on sugarcane. And it was very, very small. You had a tiny room. There would be multiple people per shack, usually a family unit. And only times when families would be split was either for trading, for marriage, for quote-unquote disciplinary purposes. So we are currently at the house kitchen. This one was built in the 1830s. I want you guys to just kind of take a look. This is where domestic enslaved people would cook breakfast, lunch, dinner, multiple meals throughout the day. And if you take a wide pan, you look on your right side, you see the big house. So just kind of think about that contrast. Also just think about how close, right? So we got the kitchen right here, big kind of house right there. And I'll talk more about the house. So it's currently 92 degrees. As you can see, it's hot. Now just imagine people all around here working 10 to 12 hours a day. Now I'm in some shade, so I'm good. But that labor, that work brought things like this home. This home was built in 1790. And what's interesting is that this architecture, they call it the Creole, kind of the mix of the indigenous and European architecture, because this house is not what most people think about when we say plantation house. Most people think of big columns, all white, lush lawn, kind of front lawn. But this Creole architecture was French-based, and in it really laid the foundation for a house that didn't have a basement. So the first floor, which you're seeing, is like mostly a storage area. And most families, now they did have rooms on the lower floor, but most families lived on the top. Here is an example of a plantation store. Plantation stores were places that enslaved folks could get on and have access to products and goods. A lot of times it was based on the kind of the benevolence of their master, their owner. What's interesting here is that this one was built in 1890. And you may say, well, slavery ended prior to 1890. Well, there was a system called sharecropping. And this system actually tied labor to kind of, you had like a company shop. And you could tie your work hours to stuff that you could get out the store. Or you can pay, but most of the time it just was more convenient for sharecroppers, people who work this as part-time or full-time workers, paid workers, to just use the paycheck, their credit, to come out the store. So you could buy food, clothing, fruits and things of that nature. But I would say the negative aspect is that oftentimes workers would be kind of trapped in a cycle of death. Wrapping up our time at the Whitney Plantation, I showed you all some of the key parts, at least interesting parts of our visit. A lot of things were closed down due to COVID. However, the last stop we went to was a plantation store. And I just want to talk really quickly about that. I think it ties into a lot of the trauma that enslaved people faced on the plantation and some of the pain that communities are facing now. What's interesting about the plantation store is that it actually operated to 1975. Interestingly enough, in the early 60s, when MLK was assassinated, the wage workers, the sharecroppers on this field, this plantation, actually burnt that store. And that was in the early 60s. And it was something that was commonly occurring on River Road. So I think, at least for me as a historian, it's interesting to see these cycles of oppression. The idea that something from the 18th century was still here till 1975, and to see how the people who worked here responded, and see how communities are now still struggling. It's all very interesting. Lots to think about. So thank you guys for our time at Whitney Plantation.